This is Courageous Self-Confidence, Episode 4. Hello, and welcome to Courageous Self-Confidence, a podcast committed to increasing your self-confidence. We want to encourage you and help you reflect and dig into who you truly are so that you can have a greater capacity to live out your destiny. All right. This is Samuel Hatton.
And Weston Picorni.
We are in Weston Picorni's garage. We record at 5 a.m. At least a couple times a week. So I'm really excited to be here, and I'm surprisingly awake. Today's episode, I want to share a story, bring a story of courage to you. Recently I had the privilege to interview my business coach, Robert Gillette. And though he's not necessarily a full-time business coach, he's had some rough experiences, and he's able to provide me a lot of wisdom. So I'm just very privileged to get to meet with him. He shared an experience with me that led him to a moment of courage, and that moment of courage is worth sharing on the show. So it basically started fall 2011. Robert had been out of work for a couple years, and he was laid off. And at this point, he was looking to grow his freelance photography business, and then an opportunity presented itself.
And we had approached Kay's Bridal because we wanted to be their exclusive wedding photographer that they recommended to their customers. And it turned out, as we were talking with the people who were in charge there, that the owner of Kay's Bridal had actually passed away a little tragically from cancer about a year previously, and the store wasn't doing so hot, and they were losing a lot of money, and they were thinking about going out of business. And then this friend that was kind of a recent friend introduced us to the owner. It was the owner's husband, who was just kind of dealing with this business and this estate, and he offered to sell it to us. And we had never bought a business before. I had run several businesses myself, but they were just me and my product. I had never dealt with retail and leases and employees and things like that. And so I spent about 6 months putting together a business plan. And just before we presented our first version of that business plan, Karina got the job of her dreams, which was her geology job that she went to school for the company she interned with. So the whole business plan had to change with me running the store.
So Robert took some bold action and started a new venture. And his wife got a new job, which left Robert in a very awkward position after he opened his shop. So this is what happened next.
And I remember sitting there talking with our marketing girl. She wasn't just like advertising. She was like, how do we want to brand the store? How do we want to operate? Who do we want to be to our customers? And I remember dividing the bridesmaids' dresses in half, sitting on the floor, and then closing them in front of me and just crying. And just thinking to myself, this was about 5 days into owning the store. I'm by myself. I have employees that are just terrible because they, for the last 2 years, have been thinking that, I have a job the next day. So they're not invested in the store. They don't know me from Jack. This person they worked with for 10 years they loved just died. And here I am in the store that has a terrible reputation, and I'm just like crying, and I'm just like, oh my God, why did you lead me here? This was a terrible decision. I remember just for a good 5 minutes just like crying and thinking to myself, what have I done? I've ruined my life. Hiding under some dresses while my poor marketing girl stood in the room having no idea what to do.
So that moment of courage has not happened yet. This was where we are right now in the story is pretty much a moment of desperation, a moment where Robert felt paralyzed by fear. So I asked Robert, well, what did you do in this moment to overcome that? And this is what he said.
What I did to overcome it was, first of all, just to cry it out. That's kind of silly, but there's no use hiding from the things that are, wrenching your heart like that. When something is really affecting you that deeply, you can't just run from it and push it down or whatever. You have to you have to just kind of embrace it, for a moment. You can't let it overrun you, but you have to just embrace it for a moment. And if you don't understand what you're feeling and what you're going through, you can't address it. So I took a moment. I took those 5 minutes to just sit in my misery and kind of discover what that really meant to me in reality. And then it's kind of weird, but you make the conscious decision to say, well, is this it? Did my whole life amount to this moment and I'm just done? Should I just roll over and die right now? And then you ask yourself, what's the worst that could happen? And the worst that could happen is what we talked about earlier before we go out the business. And so here I am in the midst of it. And I say, I can't not keep going. You can't just give up here. You have a plan. Maybe you made that plan off of bad information, or maybe it's bigger than you thought it was, but you can't just sit under these dresses until the store closes and then Jesus is going to come back. Like you have to go to work the next day and you have to keep moving and you can't just give up. And so that's what I did is I just got out from under the dresses and, I asked my marketing, okay, what do we do today? What can I do today? What's the plan? And we addressed the thing we could address that day. And you just do that every day, hour by hour, whatever, minute by minute, whatever you have to do. What can I do now?
Robert had a lot of good stuff to pull out of himself in his heart deep down in that moment. Such good stuff. This was a moment of courage, even though it didn't look like courage from the outset. But what was going on in his head and in his heart is where the courage was really happening. It was the choices he made in that moment.
The conscious decisions.
Right. He said, what's the worst that can happen? And he's like, well, I already know what the worst that can happen because we've already talked about this. He had spent that time planning and figuring out what the worst thing can happen. So it's almost like he already figured out his fears and all he had to do is kind of pull up that planning time.
At some point he had mentioned that it's a process in dealing with fear, and that process is that you have to just feel it. You don't want to escape
right.
it. He had a moment where it may seem like he escaped, but he was just feeling his feelings and thinking through everything from the inception to where he was at and what might be coming. And then he woke up and got to work.
He said, and then I just had to work the plan set out for me. When fear starts setting in, you have to go straight through it. You have to embrace it and then just work it.
Right. There was another point where he had mentioned that, he knew he had to just do the tough things.
Today, what can I do today?
Right.
Robert talked about another concept after he had shared this story that I found really helpful. Circle of influence. And I'll share that with you right here.
Yeah, this is excellent.
There's this idea of the circle of influence, the things you can actually address. Inside of that circle of influence, there is no fear because you can address those things. Outside of that circle of influence are the things you can't control, and that's where fear lives. It's because it's all the things that may or may not happen that you can't directly affect. And so if you focus on those, you get consumed by your fear. But if you focus on the things inside the circle, you address the things you can control, and that helps you because you're doing something. And you address the things you can control, and you focus in on that, and eventually that circle gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then the fears just can't exist because they get pushed out by that circle.
So what do you think of that? Of now versus the past? We're trapped between two eternities. Eternity past, eternity future, and fear lives in tomorrow or dwelling on the past or dwelling on too far in the future. So when he mentioned the circle of influence and being inside, that was a safe zone, and that
right.
set him up.
What are the things that he can influence? What does he have control over? And there's no fear in that because you have control. I really liked when he was saying like the circle can expand, and fear just gets pushed out because your circle of influence gets bigger. You're able to contribute to more of the factors as time goes on.
Right. I also see the edge of that circle as the pressure zone. So when you're in the safe boundary of what you can do, but when you push up to the edge of that circle, that's where that pressure causes growth. And then as that circle expands, you now have a new level of comfort and a new level of opportunity to keep expanding.
Right. So, you know what this all really comes down to is you just got to face it, you know? I'm sure there's stuff that you're dealing with right now, and it's always uncomfortable when you're pushing the boundaries of your influence. But man, it's so worth it, you know? You live and you learn, and you end up getting tons of wisdom, and that's exactly what is portrayed within Robert's life. Is he's just a wealth of wisdom because he's been through these experiences. He's pushed through his fear, and he didn't run away. He faced it. So I encourage you to do that. Do that with whatever you might be facing, and live a courageous life. It's only going to contribute to your self-confidence, you know, going through these experiences. Do you have any final words to say?
You know, I've stumbled across this quote: both fortune and love befriend the bold. Ovid.
All right. Thank you, Weston. Well, that's it for this episode, and we thank you so much for joining us. This is Samuel Hatton
And Weston Pokorny.
signing out. What does it mean to be completely aligned with your beliefs and your thoughts and your actions? That's next time on Courageous Self-Confidence. You know, I forgot one last thing.
Yes.
Where can people find you?
Probably the best way is to go to robertgillette.us. That's where my photography is kind of housed, and a blog that I never update. But that's kind of the email I check the most. So if people have questions, they can check me out there. And